this was the catalyst for the exhibition. This is our only painting by Claude Monet. It's called Champs d'Avoine, which in French means oat field. And it depicts the oats and the poppies near Monet's home in the village of Giverny, which is only about 60 miles outside of Paris. Monet painted this view en plein air, or outdoors, so that he could capture the fleeting light effects of the light and the weather and atmosphere. The dabs and the dots of the vibrant color that you see here in the short, textured strokes of paint reflect light and give the impression of movement, which was something that the Impressionists valued greatly. This interest in painting outdoors paralleled the recent invention of portable paint tubes in the 1840s. And before then, it was difficult for artists to spend extended periods of time painting outdoors because their pigments, their paints, were constantly drying on their palette. But with the portable paint tubes, they were able to spend much more extended periods of time painting outdoors on site, which is why you see series paintings, artists painting the same scene in maybe 3, 4, or 5 different landscapes so they could capture the same view at different times of day, switching from one canvas to the other throughout the day as the light changed. Soon after Monet painted this work, an American art dealer sent a very excited telegram to one of his clients in Rhode Island. The client's name is John Nicholas Brown, whose family was one of the founders of Brown University. And in this telegram, he urged his client to buy this painting. He had seen this painting, and the client simply had to buy it because, quote, it was a masterpiece and it will be worth $10,000 someday, he said. And we all know the incredible prices that Impressionist paintings draw at auction today. Monet painted Champs d'Avoine in 1890, and this was at the height of his career. But let's back up 20 years earlier, when his paintings were not so popular, and in fact they were considered outrageous. This is a painting that Monet exhibited in 1874 at the very first Impressionist exhibition in Paris. It was painted in 1872, and he gave it the title Impression Sunrise. He exhibited this in the first Impressionist exhibition along with paintings by Edgar Degas and Auguste Renoir and other French Impressionists who exhibited together in 8 shows between 1874 and 1886. These were considered a renegade group of artists. They painted in a revolutionary new style. Today, we're so accustomed to seeing Impressionist painting that we don't realize how scandalous it was at the time, how confusing it was to critics, to the public, to museum goers, and to other artists. Instead of painting very highly finished techniques that describe objects with great attention to detail, very carefully modulated, carefully described, very careful attention to perspective, linear perspective, the Impressionists painted in a new style that emphasized loose brushworks, the breaking of solidity. They painted in bright, unblended colors. They were also interested in optics and experimented with new ways of seeing, partly because they were just interested in new things and were searching for a new vocabulary with which to paint modern life. So they blurred edges, possibly because of the influence of photography, which was a new medium. They also painted from unique angles, very unusual croppings of images or objects, and they preferred asymmetrically balanced compositions. A very hostile critic by the name of Louis Leroy visited the 1874 first Impressionist exhibition in which this Impression Sunrise was exhibited, and he thought it was awful. He thought it was a mere impression is what he called it. In other words, implying that it was unfinished, that it was just a sketch. And that is how the group became known as the Impressionists. Artists protested against their work and their exhibitions, and one of the American artists who was studying in Paris at the time, J. Alden Weir, visited the 1877 Impressionist exhibition and wrote home to his parents back in the United States, quote, "I never in my life saw more horrible things. It was worse than the Chamber of Horrors." And there are even stories of Gérôme, the famous academic painter, standing in front of one of the exhibitions, preventing people from going in, saying, "Don't go in there, the shame of the French Republic is behind those doors." Today, Impressionism is one of the most beloved art movements, not only in the United States, but across the globe. Exhibitions on the subject draw huge crowds, and artists love to see work by Monet, Degas, Renoir, and other famous Impressionists who today are household names. Yet the general public is not as familiar with the American artists who were also influenced by Impressionism and spent extended periods of time in Giverny, or learned about Impressionist painting by visiting other exhibitions in Paris or even in New York and Boston. It's generally recognized that Monet is the main reason why Impressionism is so influential, or was so influential on American painting, that he, of all the Impressionists, was the one who influenced American artists the most. Beginning in the 1880s, many American artists who were studying in Paris started making the easy train ride from Paris to Giverny. And they often spent their summer breaks, for example, in Giverny. And one of the earliest artists to do this was Theodore Robinson. And we're looking at several photographs. The one on the left is a photograph taken by Theodore Robinson of Monet. And the one on the right shows Robinson seated at the easel, painting en plein air. So in Giverny, you had this colony of artists growing up around the personality of Monet. And they were centered around a hotel where a lot of them stayed, where they could rent rooms. It had tennis courts, a cafe, and offered a social nexus for the artists who flocked there. The acquisition of Champ d'Avoine at the Harn Museum occurred in 1999. It was actually purchased by a local businessman who called the museum director at the time and said, "Hey, I'm in London on a business trip. There's the most incredible painting by Monet in a gallery, Richard Green Gallery. Would you like it? I want to buy it for the Harn Museum." So there's only one answer to that question, and it's yes. So that is how the painting ended up in the Harn collection. It was, at the time, the only Impressionist painting in the collection. It still is the only French Impressionist painting in the collection. And it led to a new collecting strategy to try and bridge the gap between the 19th century and Impressionism and the American paintings of the 1920s and 30s that were one of the main strengths of the Harn's American collection. Two of the first acquisitions include these two paintings here, a work by Theodore Robinson, Afternoon Shadows, which was painted in Giverny just a year after our Champ d'Avoine, and Childe Haslam's Gloucester of 1919, which is an American subject. As I mentioned before, Theodore Robinson was one of the first Americans who spent time in Giverny, and he actually spent 6 months of every year in Giverny for a period of years until his health condition, his asthma, made it too difficult for him to continue, and he had to remain in New York after that point, but became a very important teacher of another generation of artists. In contrast, Childe Hassam never, as we think, never visited Giverny. There's no documentation that he was ever there. But he studied in Paris. He saw exhibitions of Impressionist paintings in Paris, also in New York and Boston in the 1890s, and became a real adherent of Impressionism. So as we acquired a small group of American Impressionist paintings, it became a goal to organize an exhibition that would address the influence of Monet on these artists during Monet's lifetime. As evident in the works on display, each of the artists included 25 artists in the exhibition, all responded in different ways and to different degrees. And these are the groupings here. The Allure of Giverny and A Country Retreat address the theme of painting outdoors and plein air, and you'll see a lot of images of landscapes bathed in light and atmosphere. The vibrance of urbanism includes city streets and iconic images like bridges, parks, and other urban landmarks. The comfort of home addresses gardens and sunlit interiors in which women often play a central role. And then finally, a graphic legacy includes prints And it's interesting that people don't often think of Impressionist prints, and how does one go about translating a very painterly medium into an unpainterly one, into etchings and engravings and lithographs. But a small number of Impressionists did create prints. For example, Edgar Degas' etchings of dancers, and Renoir's etchings and lithographs of women reclining and bathing. And a number of Americans also did, so we have a lot of examples. The one here is an example in the lower right by Mary Cassatt. At left is a view from the installation at the Harn Museum, our main title wall and entrance. And this is how it was presented at the Harn. The exhibition features nearly 50 paintings. There are also a few watercolors, a pastel, a couple bronzes, and about 25 prints. And these were contributed by 28 museums and collections. Of course, you know about the Hunter Museum's contributions, the Harn Museum, and also the Telfair Museums. These are the three partners who worked together to make the show happen. But all the other museums on the right also contributed very important works to the exhibition, and we couldn't have pulled this off without this huge number of people participating and through all their support. So you'll see some names that you recognize on here, I'm sure. Of course, the National Gallery of Art, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, maybe some of you know the Terra Foundation for American Art, so some real prestigious institutions. In addition to works by Monet, my goals for the exhibition included securing the loan of paintings by leading names in American art. So Theodore Robinson, Child Hassam, Frederick Friesica, and many others, Mary Cassatt, artists who were active in Giverny, others who maybe weren't, but became really prominent Impressionists like Child Hassam, as well as artists who are often overlooked in exhibitions on Impressionism. I also wanted to include women artists. How many women artists were active as Impressionists? There weren't very many. We all know of Mary Cassatt, probably one of the most famous, but others include artists like Lilla Cabot-Perry, represented in the Hunter Museum collection, and a few other artists in the exhibition. I was also interested in what was the impact of Impressionism in the South. So there are a few artists, including Gary Melchers and Helen Maria Turner from the South, who are represented in the exhibition. Securing the loan of these valuable paintings required our ability to meet very stringent security requirements. For example, some of the paintings, and you probably have set off alarms, I have. I just did upstairs a little while ago. Some of the paintings on loan have special alarms, extra guards, additional security cameras, all to protect the safety of the art. And they were absolutely required by the lenders. We wouldn't have this exhibition in its current presentation if not for being able to meet all those stringent requirements. The most challenging aspect of the show was securing the loan of the three works by Monet that are in addition to the painting that the Harn owns. Would there be any Monet paintings in addition to the Harn painting was something we grappled with for a long period of time. Would we have to change the title of the show from Monet and American Impressionism to just American Impressionism? That was suggested to me along the way because it became very difficult to secure the few that we do have in the exhibition. I looked at my original proposal. I proposed that we would have 10 paintings by Monet in the show. Then that was reduced to 6. Then it was reduced to 5. In the end, we have 4 total, and that was very exciting. But it just shows you how unrealistic expectations can be, and you have to tailor your plans. The most common response we received from museums was that some of their Monet paintings, first of all, to have more than one is like an embarrassment of riches. Some of these museums have 40. Can you imagine? And we actually approached them. Could we borrow just one? And the responses we got were, oh, so many of them are already promised. There are exhibitions traveling all over the world, all over Europe, London, Italy, Asia. And the few that we have left, they would say, are vital to the educational mission of our museum, and they have to stay on view in our museum. We simply cannot lend them. Luckily, we were able to secure Monet's Waterloo Bridge of 1903 from the Lowe Museum of Art, the University of Miami. And it's possible that being a fellow university art museum was part of the reason why they agreed to participate, so that we could support each other's endeavors, academic endeavors in the state of Florida. On the right is a picture of the director of the Lowe Museum, Jill Delpy, as she inspects their painting after it was hung in the Harn Museum exhibition. Monet painted this view from the windows of the hotel where he was staying in London. He made several trips to London between 1899 and 1901, and he painted this view from the windows and the balcony of his suite overlooking the Thames River. And he painted it, he did a series of paintings. I don't remember if it was 30 or I think it was even more than that, of this view painted at different times of day. So they were painted there. We could consider that en plein air. They're painted out the window. This is the view from his hotel room. But these canvases were mostly unfinished, taken back to Giverny where they were finished. So there is some studio work involved. Don't think that paintings are all done en plein air and that there is no studio work, but there is a little bit of studio work. Artists make notes and sketches, impressions in their notebooks that they can then call to mind as they're finishing up their work in their studios. As demonstrated here, the series focuses on the transformative beauty of fog as it both obscures and reveals the solidity of the bridge and its arches. Themes of contemporary life in the city were very important and very common in Impressionist painting, and we often see images of harbors, iconic bridges, and public squares, and you'll see some of those themes in the American works in the show as well. This painting, Rising Tide at Pourville, from 1882, and this is on loan from the Brooklyn Museum in Brooklyn, New York. And it's another stellar example of a Monet painting that you'll see as a centerpiece of the country retreat section of the exhibition. Monet was captivated by the dramatic Normandy coastline and the picturesque villages along the shore in Normandy and the cliff-top cottages, and this is an example of one. These were built centuries before. They were occupied by customs officers who were responsible for looking out over the English Channel. But at the time that Monet painted these scenes, they had since been abandoned and were admired more for their picturesque quality. And so he painted this from a viewpoint in which we have a very high horizon line, which really causes us to focus on the gorgeous application of paint on the gorgeous ocean rising up above this gorgeous cliff in Normandy. The asymmetrical composition with the very strongly focused to the right cottage and a cliff is another element that was also very common in Monet's paintings. You may be wondering why I've included this bold and dramatic double portrait on the right. This is a portrait by Kehinde Wiley, and the reason I'm including it is to tell you a little bit of the backstory here about how we secured the loan of this painting by Monet. Sometimes in order to secure a pivotal work in an exhibition, it's necessary to agree to an exchange, an art exchange. And in this case, the Brooklyn Museum was organizing a retrospective of Kehinde Wiley, who's a very famous contemporary artist. The exhibition opened at the Brooklyn the same month that we opened our Impressionism show in February. And while their Monet is traveling with Monet and American Impressionism, our Kehinde Wiley is traveling with the Brooklyn Museum show, which will be going to 10 museums across the country. So it'll be gone for 3 years. This slide includes two views of the exhibition as it was presented at the Harn in Gainesville. The presentation of the art is just as important as securing the loan of art. Each painting is a star and needs its breathing room. Visitors need opportunities to step back, to admire. People always want to look up close, step back. We have that whole mystique around Impressionism that you need to look up close at the individual dabs of paint, but you need to step back to see how they all blend in the eye. So everyone wants to be able to do that. It's also important to realize that works of art interact with each other, and placement of each painting has to be carefully thought out. So next I'd like to show you a few behind-the-scenes insights into how this process works and how an exhibition is implemented from checklist to final product. This part of the process isn't very glamorous, but it's absolutely necessary. At the Harn, we work with a 3D model. It's 25 years old now. It's old, decrepit, it's full of dust, it's pretty gross, but we're still using it. We're resistant to technology. Some of the curators are not using more exciting programs that some of the other museums are using. We still rely heavily on this model, but it really helps us to experience the space and how the final product will look in the space. It's also true that no matter how much advanced planning that you put into a project, nothing will go exactly as planned, and you always have to remain flexible. Before the art arrives, walls are positioned according to the curator's plan. The gallery space is painted and prepped, and at the same time, while this is going on, there's a very complicated orchestration of art shipments that is underway. Trucks that move priceless art from museum to museum have 2 drivers, a sleeping area, so the trucks never have to stop overnight, because as you can imagine, a truck with millions of dollars worth of art on it parked overnight at a Days Inn is never a good idea. So during breaks, one driver is awake, one can sleep. During breaks, then someone always remains with the artwork at all time. In some cases, museum staff also ride on the truck. And that's a really interesting experience. You also take turns sleeping in the back while the other 2 drivers are awake. Remember my comment about having to remain flexible? Well, we faced a very serious challenge getting the works, some of the works that were on loan from the museums in the Northeast, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art and some of the other New York museums, to Florida in January. So I don't know if you recall, there was a huge snowstorm around January 24 to 26, something like that, and it caused a last-minute crisis. We opened our show on February 2nd, and this was one of the last groups of art that was coming on this one shipment. It was the paintings from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that gorgeous Monet painting from the Brooklyn Museum, and a number of other museums, and they almost didn't arrive in time. But luckily, the streets were cleared. No art was released from any museum knowing that this blizzard was coming. So once the streets were cleared, then the green light was given, and the truck was loaded, and they were on their way. The picture to the left shows a series of crates lined up and waiting to be unpacked. And as you can imagine, with each crate unpacked, it was like Christmas. Once unpacked, each work is inspected before it's hung on the wall, and that's what you see happening in that upper left. That's actually a courier from the Reynolda House Museum of Art who came to supervise the unpacking, the condition reporting, and then the installation on the wall, which you see happening in the lower left. This is a priceless pastel by Mary Cassatt, one of the most famous American Impressionists and a woman artist also. I also need to let you know that the amount of light that shines on a work of art is really important and must be regulated. Paintings can take about 15 to 20 what we call foot candles, and this is how light is metered or measured. It's measured 1 lumen per square foot. Works on paper, on the other hand, are typically limited to only 5-foot candles. So that's why when you're looking at an exhibition, if you're looking at a work on paper, that's why it seems dim, especially if it's hung next to an oil painting, which might be lit up all the way to, say, 20-foot candles. But that's the reason. It's very important in terms of preserving the work. Views of light-filled gardens comprise a major theme in Impressionist painting. The work on the left is by Frederick Friesica, on the right is by Theodore Butler. Originally from Ohio, Theodore Butler studied in Paris and first visited Giverny in 1888. And eventually he established a very close friendship with Monet. In fact, he married one of Monet's stepdaughters, Suzanne. And this work depicts the family garden in the home where Butler lived. And here you see it in this luxurious garden in this blanket of gorgeous pastels. Frederick Friesica was originally from Michigan, and he spent most of his career living in Paris and also in Giverny, and rented a home adjacent to Monet's. This painting shows his wife, Sadie, who is sitting at a table with her back to the viewer. She's pouring tea for her guest, who you see in the white dress, who casually and spontaneously has turned to greet another visitor and presumably the viewer who's looking at this gorgeous painting. Sadie was an avid gardener, and she and Monet became friendly over the topic of gardens because he was also a very avid gardener. Monet painted his future stepdaughters, Blanche and Suzanne. Blanche is painting in the upper right, while her sister Suzanne sits reading a book. This painting is not in the exhibition, but I include it as an example of a woman painting outdoors and plein air and also associated in the circle of Monet. How common was it for women to be professional painters at this time? Lilla Cabot Perry was one of the few American women artists to spend time in Giverny in the 1880s, and this painting is very familiar to you. It's from the Hunter Museum collection, and we're really excited that it has been part of the exhibition and was in Gainesville and will be traveling to the Telfair in a few months. Around 1900, so about 20 years earlier than these paintings were created, it was more common for young women to study art abroad. But in the 1880s, it was less common. In fact, the Ladies' Home Journal had an article that said, "Is Paris wise for young girls?" The New York Tribune had an article that warned about the dangers and the temptations for these young women artists in Paris, that they might cave in to the temptations of the city, and that they would feel that somehow, as artists in a bohemian culture, that they would be immune from the conventions or conventional morality. So these were the fears. Lilla Cabot Perry was born into an old New England family. She was part of Boston's social elite, and this privileged status allowed her to pursue her career as a painter, although she didn't spend that much energy on her painting until she was already 30 and her children were already a little bit older. So she was able to pursue her career because of this privileged status, and also because her husband spent a lot of time in Europe and she traveled with him and took courses in painting in Paris. She also painted in plein air. However, she didn't devote a lot of time to painting outdoors as much as she wanted, because her husband always complained that when she came back in from painting outdoors, she always looked disheveled, and he didn't want to see her that way. And plus, there were social restrictions against women spending time painting outdoors unaccompanied. Like Monet, who escaped Paris for Giverny, American artists enjoyed escaping the city for rural retreats. So here's an example of a work by Child Hassam, Ironbound, and I'm comparing it to a work by Monet, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but unfortunately we couldn't borrow it, but we were able to picture it in our exhibition catalog. Hassam was often described in his day as the American Monet, which is very interesting because he didn't spend any time in Giverny, he never knew Monet personally, so it's fascinating that he was able to absorb the techniques and the style, the language, so fully that the American press called him the American Monet. This painting, Ironbound, is a breathtaking view of the cliffs of Ironbound Island, which is in Frenchman's Bay in Maine. The cliffs and the rocky surfaces are animated by the broken strokes of color and the reflected light, and they recall dramatic seascapes that Monet painted in the Normandy coast, such as the work that I include here on the right. And several paintings by Monet of the Normandy coast were exhibited in Boston and New York in the 1890s, so Hassam was familiar with these paintings through those venues. Both of these paintings from the Hunter collection depict urban settings. The Child Hassam is set in a city park in Paris, while the William Glackens is in a New York City park. Hassam painted French tea garden during a return trip to Europe in 1910. The setting is an urban garden in Paris, And this offered a peaceful escape from the grime of the city, the dirt that Hassan complained about in his letters to his friends and family back home. He complained incessantly about how dirty Paris was and how much he enjoyed escaping to the more rural, cleaner areas. So here we have a very refined lady, presumably his wife, Maud, seated at a small table that's been laid with a terracotta tea set and flowers. And the two teacups imply that there is someone missing. Presumably it's her husband, but she's engrossed in her sewing and not addressing the viewer, so we don't know who she's waiting for. Maybe she's waiting for us to enter the painting. The William Glackens was painted in New York. We have the horse chestnut tree in Washington Square, a prominent New York City park. And after this return trip to Europe in 1906, his style underwent a transformation, and he became more absorbed by the soft colors and outlines and the brilliant colors of Impressionism, both the works of Monet and also the work of Renoir. Both of these paintings ignore the grime and the dirt of the cities. I commented on that earlier. You know, cities in this time were filthy, there was a lot of pollution, smog, factories, and yet, for the most part, American Impressionists did not address those themes. Their paintings are more beautiful images that present people in gorgeous surroundings and represent women in these beautiful surroundings that are, for example, gardens and park settings. And they ignored some of the social changes that were happening at the time, such as women's suffrage, women who were involved in educational pursuits more so than in the previous century. Women were now more involved as working women. And yet you don't see those images addressed in Impressionist paintings by American artists for the most part. The final images I have to share represent the latest dated works in the exhibition. These are from the 1920s. And they demonstrate the longevity of Impressionism in the US from its earliest introductions in the 1890s up until its waning in popularity in the 19-teens. Originally from New Orleans, Maria Helen Turner is best known for her landscapes and everyday scenes of beautiful young women in elegant surroundings. In Lily's Lanterns and Sunshine, two girls hold Japanese lanterns in a garden setting, which was actually in an artist colony north of New York City. Willard Metcalf's Buttercup Time is a sweeping vista of a springtime scene in a rural New England village, and it's painted in the shimmering effects that capture the transience, the spring day, the transience of the clouds, typical Impressionist subject and handling of paint. The longevity of some of these Impressionist artists, such as Metcalf, he was active in Giverny in the 1880s, and here we see him painting, still in the Impressionist mode, in 1920. So the longevity of some of these artists contributed to the enduring presence and influence of Impressionism in the United States well into the 1920s and beyond. So its presence some 40 years after the last official Impressionist exhibition in Paris in 1886 make it among one of the most viable modes of art making in the history of American art. And those are all of my comments, and I hope that you will take some of the things that I talked about and think about them as you go upstairs and enjoy the exhibition a little more.